Thank you very much for coming today. I hope you have an appetite for Bremen history. I have too many slides here. I was given far too much time to put this together, and I was still working on it. Still working on it today. Bremen, Indiana is a small rural town. The reason you build a town in a rural area is to support your farmers, so they have a place to bring their livestock and crops to market, and also to buy their groceries and things like that. So you always have to think of Bremen, especially more so than Plymouth and other similar towns, in that light. So we'll start with Bremen. A history of a good town, visit our library. That's what the welcome sign welcoming you into town used to say. It always cracked us up. We'll start with the topography, demographics, and industry of Bremen a little bit to give you context. So Bremen sits, as you can see this red line here, sits in the loving arms of the Yellow River drainage valley. And you can see that this whole area in the pioneer days was very marshy. It was either forest or marshland. And the story of the whole area is very much a story of draining those marshes and draining the fields with field tile. A lot of that was made in Bremen itself. We had our own tile company and dug the ditches. My father's father was a ditcher. On my mother's side, her father's father was a ditcher, and then they became farmers. It was ubiquitous, and that led to some very wonderful mucky soil that allowed us to grow. First it was onions and things like that, but then it was mint, and Bremen became one of the mint capitals of the world. So you can see the town as it is laid out there. We are currently a population of about 4,700. That hasn't really changed in about 20 years. What has changed are the industries in Bremen. I'll talk a lot about the foundries and other businesses like that, but today roller bearings is still a big thing. At one time we had 3 different roller bearing companies in Bremen. BCI is Bremen Castings, which has been around for a long time. That's the foundry. Southwire, which does wiring. Indiana Carton makes boxes, cardboard boxes. Johns Manville makes insulation. NISCO is Nishikawa Cooper. They make rubber seals. And Headsight is a company that makes harvesting technology. A lot of people, even in Bremen, are not familiar with Headsight. It's on a big barn facility on the south side. So that's what Bremen is today. Let's go back in time to the 1800s, the early 1800s, and you see Bremen written in the middle of this sort of blank area. This is a map of Native American villages. Both Potawatomi and Miami. The Potawatomi actually kind of drove the Miami out of the area. Then you see the permanent encampments along the major rivers down below in this area. This is Chief Menominee's band that was the last to leave. There were a lot of treaties that were made in the early 1800s, on pretty shaky ground, a lot of them, and finally Menominee said, I didn't sign any treaty. And they were forced out in 1838. So it was 1836 when white settlers, European settlers, started coming into the area of Bremen. But you'll notice that there weren't any permanent settlements in the immediate Bremen area. And I believe that's because, I think we'll see it in 1 or 2 slides, I think the Yellow River, especially in the Bremen area, was not really navigable. It was wide, it was very marshy, very grassy, and shallow. And it has, of course, practically all waterways in the United States have been dredged out and straightened and everything. That's certainly true of the Yellow River near Bremen as well, part of which is now called Army Ditch. This is Lake of the Woods. Lake of the Woods is, of course, near Bremen. We tend to think of it as a Bremen area. It was called by the Indians Combes, after this, what is now called by us a spatterdock or yellow cow lily. It's a water lily type that is still in the area. And they actually, this is what you see down here is a rhizome, which is part of the root system, but it grows horizontally, and then the roots sort of come out of that. they would harvest this, and it has a bitter flavor to it, but they would dig trenches and put them in there and then burn leaf litter and branches and things over the top of them for like 4 days. And I believe that that softened them up and reduced that bitterness. So that was one of their crops at the time. The Lake of the Woods had resort facilities as early as the 1880s. So it was very quickly thought of as a place to go and enjoy the water, to have parties and that sort of thing. Many of you here probably are familiar with the Huckleberry Queen and things like that that were a little further away, but it was there at the Lake of the Woods as well, to a degree. 1836, like I say, is when the European settlers started coming in. The earliest families were Byler, Heim, Herzog, Kuntz, which later changed to C-O-O-N-T-Z for part of the family. Ringel, Weiss, and Yaki. The first child was, the first European child in the area was Elizabeth Ringel, and she married a Yaki, as you might imagine. Permelia Pitts Grove is related to some Bremen folks, but she actually grew up several miles east in Locke Township of Elkhart County. She wrote in her memoir, I was sent on an errand once. Now this is remember, she was growing up she was one of the Permelia Pitts Grove was the first European child born in Locke Township of Elkhart County. So we're talking about this same era, right? 1830s and early 1840s. I was sent on an errand once, and wild hogs gave me quite a chase, but I managed to keep out of their way by climbing a fence. Everything, and we're talking about a split rail fence, right? We're talking Abraham Lincoln style fences here. Everything was woods for miles, and they were inhabited by bear, wolves, and deer. We lived on deer and bear meat until we were tired of it. We chased off or killed all of those animals. There were no deer in the area, in the Bremen area at least, until like 1963. They didn't come back. But it is wonderful actually how some of the animals have come back. We now have not only deer, but we see coyotes and things like that in the area, which I didn't remember seeing when I was a kid. Founding the town in 1851, technically. So in 1847, there was a man named David Brothers who owned property on what we would call the northeast side of Bremen. He owned a farm, and he set up a log cabin that was a store of sorts. And he became the postmaster. He was appointed postmaster in 1847, and he referred to that post office as Brothersville. This was located on what we would think of as that fork in the road on the east side of Bremen, where you're going out of town, and you can choose to either go regularly east or continue on 331 east, or make that swing up to US 6, right? And in 1848, George Pomeroy took over as the postmaster, and he came from a family here in Plymouth that had helped establish Plymouth. And their family ultimately came from New York previously as pioneers. And he said that that area should not be called Brothersville. It should be named after the German people who were populating that area. It was called German Township because the very earliest pioneers came from Germany and some from Switzerland. They spoke German on a regular basis. It was the heart of the town for a long time. He got a guy named Josiah Geiselman, who was running a store in nearby, to agree to come over, and they would start a town where we think of Bremen is today. In fact, they were, George Pomeroy, he purchased land from David Brothers on the west side of David Brothers' farm, and that today is, the location is Sunrise Pancake House. And Josiah Geiselman built his log cabin, which was a blacksmith shop, where Dietrich's store went, which is today the B-Fit So that was the very beginning of Bremen properly. George Pomeroy's business was it was a general store, it was an inn, it was a tavern, it was kind of all those things, a big log cabin. Along with them came a man named Cooper and another man named Bush, a man named Bush who was a Cooper, and a man named Parker who was a shoemaker, and that was the very beginning of the town. Here you see the United States record actually showing in 1874 the beginning of a post office called Brothersville with David Brothers as the postmaster, and that was taken over in '48 by George Pomeroy, and they called it Bremen. A post office doesn't have to be called the same thing, or the town and the post office don't have to have the same name, right? Bigger cities have post offices, multiple post offices, but you can name them whatever you want. But typically in small towns, they have the same name as the town. It just makes it easier. But the post office had a thing about one-word post office names. So this caused problems for Culver, which had previously been called like Union City, and then Unionville. They squished it together so it would be one word. And then they changed their name to Marmont, and then finally Culver. They actually wanted to call the town New Bremen, and that's the way it appears on certain early maps. But the post office was always called Bremen. Now, at some point, the pronunciation changed to Bremen, and nobody knows exactly when. It wasn't ever remarked in the newspaper or anything. They probably didn't even necessarily think of it as a change. 1851 is when the original town was actually platted. It was 48 lots platted by George Byler on land that had previously been owned by Daniel Ringel. So what we see here is the center of town, Plymouth Street and Center Street. And this is where George Pomeroy built his store, and this is where Josiah Geiselman built his blacksmith shop. And then there were quickly those other log cabin shops right along East Plymouth Street here. This was a great spot that they chose because Plymouth Street is the Plymouth Goshen Trail, right? It's the first proper road in the area. But you see, this is the original place where the log cabins were built. Plymouth Goshen Trail is the first road in the area going from the county seat in, Elkhart County and in Marshall County. And if you've ever wondered why Plymouth Goshen Trail kind of meanders through the countryside, it's because it was staying on the high ground between the marshy land. Wherever they ran into the marshland, they had to build what they called a corduroy road, which was cutting down trees and putting the logs horizontally, almost like a bridge, through that water, and sort of piling up whatever dirt and other rocks and things they could to help support that road. It was very rough, like running your hand across corduroy fabric, and people didn't enjoy driving across it. But even it lasted a long time. They ended up just paving over those roads. Even in town, they dug them up when they started building one of the bridges on the north side of Bremen, dug up a bunch of corduroy road logs. So that was very common. But this is high ground between the forks of the Yellow River. So the Yellow River goes from the north side to the west side. And so you cross that going in or out of town on the west side of Bremen. But also there's the middle fork of the Yellow River that crosses over the north side of Bremen, which is now Army Ditch because it was straightened out. Joseph Army was the name of a farmer, not the Army Corps of Engineers or anything like that. They named the ditches after the farmers who requested them. And then Middle Fork also goes to the east side of Bremen. So you go over the same river no matter how you enter Bremen, north, east, or west, right? And all of that ultimately comes together here in Plymouth. But this is high ground, about 25 feet above the river. You see 1851 is when the first schoolhouse was built, and that was a log cabin. 1854, the first sawmill was established. Everyone said it's pretty terrible, sawmill. And 1855, the first church was built. That was the Lutheran church. That was also a log cabin. That was located, the first church, just west of the town cemetery today. I just had somebody come into the History Center the other day and ask about what church was just to the west of the cemetery. That was the beginning of the Bremen Cemetery, and that was the Lutheran Church. 1856, the first flour mill was built by Christian Schilt, again, and Andrew Schmachtenberger, which is a great name. This was the beginning of a town that would support the farmers in the area. In 1854, the Dietrich family came to town. Yes?
I'm related to them.
Oh, okay, yes. Many folks are. The Dietrich family was very successful and very instrumental in the town. So John Rudolph Dietrich came from Switzerland in 1851 to America, and in 1854 he came to Bremen specifically, and he became first a cabinet maker, and then he sold that off pretty quickly and started a grocery instead, because he decided that we needed a grocery more than we needed furniture. And his son John Rudolph, son of John Randolph Dietrich, started the dry goods store in 1873. And then in 1875, he built the building that we think of as Dietrich's building. It was recently sold off now, but it's still the BFIT today. They started some banking out of that building as well, and the brothers, you see John over here, and his brother Christian, he was a partner in the business. William became a doctor. Pete was a partner in the business, and he became the banker. And Clara was married to a doctor herself. Mary was married to a hardware man. And so the brothers ran the store as sort of the heart of Bremen for quite a while. And they were kind of characters, I think. You see it in this 1886 article. The latest curiosity in town is a live alligator, which Chris Dietrich received last Tuesday from the Baird Boys in Hague, Florida. It is some 3 feet in length. Chris now has it in a large box and gives a free exhibition with it twice a day. No postponement on account of rain, so you can see the alligator even in the rain. The only trouble which he experiences is in keeping it from devouring the small boys who congregate around the cage in large numbers. A couple of months later, there was another bit in the newspaper about the alligator escaping and having to be caught. So I don't think they didn't mention it anymore, so I don't think it lasted long after that. May have been turned into some very fine boots. Industrializations, 1866 to 1899. So this was a big period in Bremen history. Here is a map of the town in 1886. And what you see here is John J. Wright's store. John J. Wright was, well, we'll see it in a little bit, started up a wood bending factory for the manufacture of things that go with buggies. That also made wood boxes later. But he also built this building, which became a grocery store, dry goods store, and it had the opera house on the second floor. That building exists today. It's recently been a Mexican restaurant, and today they just opened like a grill house in there. But it's apartments above. Notice all of the yellow buildings. Those are wood buildings, almost all of which are gone. The oldest of those buildings is right here. It's Fred Anderson's building, the accounting house, and what's it called? The accountants, right? The accounting firm. Right, yes. And Baker Insurance, and this is La Paria Caliente. I think all of the other wood buildings are gone today. This is the Dietrich store that was built in 1875, and Hoopel's that was built in 1882, and that's pretty much it. Here is what the town looked like in 1888, a real cowboy town of its time. These are those buildings that I just mentioned, the oldest of the wood buildings in town, and you can just sort of see Dietrich's down here. Some of these buildings burnt down in 1912 in the worst fire that we've ever.
So we're looking east here, Dave?
You're looking east, that's right, sir, on West Plymouth Street. And this is what the inside of some of those places look like. This is Valentine Fisher's harness shop. Those are horse collars and horse blankets, and this was a jewelry stand, C.C. Yankee's jewelry stand over in the corner. This was Ponitor's grocery store. You can see basically just one aisle, and the clerks stood in the other aisles behind here. This was a very common setup. Dietrich's was set up the same way, and the clerks would sort of have a stick and just knock down a can of beans if you wanted a can of beans, and put it in your basket. These are, oddly enough, these are pineapples, so that you get stuff from far away. This was a hardware store. Again, 2 aisles more or less. I mean, 3 if you count the clerk's aisle, and they would get you what you wanted down from these things. All these buildings were basically like 22 feet wide and 100 feet long. The way that you had a building built back in those days, a storefront building, was you ordered it out of a catalog. So you ordered the storefront with its various decor and windows and everything from that catalog, and then you had a local builder just build you a brick box, a big brick box, and then put that storefront on the front of the box. And here was our pump works. Since we had all those trees, we could cut them down and turn them into wood pumps. This is the 1880s. 1869 is when John J. Wright built that wood bending and box factory, the first factory in town, so it wasn't just an agricultural town. 1871 is when the town of Bremen was incorporated, and that is when we mark our beginning, really. In 1971, we had a big centennial celebration where they did all kinds of crazy things. Men were required, not all people, but only men, were required to wear beards, and you had to pay a fine or get some sort of, you had to have some sort of good reason to not wear a beard. And everybody had a good time with it. They dressed up in pioneer clothes for Pioneer Days, and they made a big deal about it. That was our 100th anniversary in 1871. So that means 2021 was our 150th anniversary, sesquicentennial, and we forgot about it. I made a, that was a pandemic, but anyway. I made a time capsule, and that is buried in the planter in front of the town hall. And there's a little plaque there that says it should be opened in 50 years on our 200th anniversary, except I don't actually say it's the 200th anniversary, it just says open it in spring of, that it was buried in spring of 2021, and it should be opened in the spring of 2071. We also got a new schoolhouse, and I'll show you some slides on the schoolhouses. 1874 is when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was laid through, and we became really a proper town where you could come and go by railroad and that sort of thing. And 1875, I mentioned John R. Dietrich built the brick store that was so important. 1882, Charlie Hoople, also very important business, built Hoople's Saloon and became a wealthy man. Tried to get into the pickle business at one time. 1885, Brooke Bauman established the Bremen Inquirer. That was not the first newspaper in town, but it's the one that lasted. It only went out of business, or it really got subsumed into the Heartland, what was it called? Heartland News in 2016. So a long and storied history, partly because the other business, the other newspaper in town, the Bremen Banner, there were a couple of other ones that came and went, but the Bremen Banner was the one that was the main rival. Those guys hated each other. And they often sniped at each other in the newspaper, until finally, the guy who ran the Bremen Banner, George Sunderland, who also had the grocery store in the Anderson building, that's where he was located, he printed a claim that Cal Sinninger, the editor of the Bremen Inquirer, his wife, had never finished paying for her wedding dress. And she took it upon herself to go over to his office and whip him with a horsewhip. So that it was sometimes physical, sniping. Cal Sininger got on somebody's wrong side, and he got beat up real bad later on, and ended up leaving town, and Brooke Bauman came back and took over the newspaper for a while. This was the most colorful time for the town and for the newspaper, and I've got several things about it. I just love the writing from this period. Here's one in 1890. The festive cow will no longer perambulate the streets of Bremen after September 1st, the city council having passed an ordinance to that effect at their meeting Wednesday night. There was a lot of complaints in the newspaper about cows roaming around the streets of Bremen during that period. And only 2 years later, boom, 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 Bremen is booming, and the reverberating echoes are heard over the country. Holland Radiator Works to be located in Bremen. So this was when Bremen became a foundry town in, as it turned out, 1893. I don't know about this, the furniture factory and Westinghouse shipping case. I don't think that actually came about. They thought that the population would double inside of a year, but that didn't quite happen. But that's all right. Where am I? 1885, 1889, Bremen establishes an agricultural fair. I got a little bit on that. That was a very big deal. People came from many miles around to come to the Bremen Fair. This is different from today's Fireman's Festival. That only got started in 1940, and the agricultural fair lasted from 1889 to 1919. 1892, the standpipe was built. That's the famous Bremen water tower in the middle of town. And well, I've got more stuff on that. 1893, Holland Radiator Foundry built. 1895, we got electricity only at night and on Tuesdays during the day. They thought of electricity as something that would give you light, right? It was for running light bulbs and not for other things so much. But they did realize that as people started making things like vacuum cleaners and stuff like that, that you would have a use for it during the day as well. And so they actually had at that time, I don't know if you've ever seen these, like the product, the machine, instead of having a plug like we have today, it would have like a light bulb screw in. So you'd unscrew your light bulb, and then you would screw in your vacuum cleaner to that same light bulb socket. That's how that worked. And in 1899, the Kuntz brothers established the Bremen Telephone Company. We have the wonderful handwritten on yellow legal pad paper from 1899, the town ordinance allowing the Kuntz brothers to start building, putting up telephone poles and connecting everybody.
Derek?
Yes?
Was John Wright, did he build barrels also? Do you know?
He might have. He might have.
Where I'm going with this, was he the one that tried to navigate the Yellow River to bring shipping to the Yellow River? There was somebody from Bremen.
Yes.
I thought they did barrels, but I could be wrong.
I don't think it was John J. Wright, but,
Okay.
But somebody tried to do that, yes.
And the boat sank
Yeah,
by the mill or something.
yeah, it was a swamp, basically.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it didn't work.
How are they gonna get it back?
Yeah. Here is that wood bending factory on the corner of Plymouth Street and Plymouth Street and Whitlock Street, South Whitlock Street. And you can see up here, it's just houses today, but this is what it looked like at that time. So another guy who was sort of instrumental in making the town what it is. Not only with this factory, but remember, he's also the guy who built the brick building that had the opera house on the second floor. The new schoolhouse in 1871 this is on Bike and Montgomery Street, so it's a block west of the Bremen Public Library. That whole block was the schoolhouse lot, and this is what the old one looked like. The bell in the tower came from the Plymouth Courthouse. And our first graduation was in the Opera House because they didn't have like a gymnasium at that time. But it was only 6 students, and they all got to give a speech. It got, like I say, it was boom times. They were building 50 houses a year at that time, and the place was getting crowded, and our certification got pulled in 1905 because of the crowding and the lack of a boys' restroom. They had to go out in the back.
Wow.
Okay.
So they built a new school in 1907. 1883, the right block. This is, again, the thing I've been talking about multiple times already. So it's not only this, which is the restaurant, but also this building here is all sort of one thing. And this was Steinig's Hardware for like 80 years. 1883, when the building was built, to 1964, Steinig Hardware finally had their going out of business auction. And there was dry goods and groceries here. There was the Opera House up on this side, and at one time there was a bowling alley in the basement. You could actually, in those days, you can't really see it here, but there are other pictures I have where you can really see that you could see down into the basements. There were window wells, and you actually kind of went across a little bridge to get into the businesses, and there were staircases down into those places. So they were, you know, you would have a restaurant down there or a barber shop or something in those basement building, or in those basements of those buildings. But they were just like Michigan basements. They were, you know, fieldstone basements. They were not beautiful at all. This is the side of that building, and you can see how this wooden hoarding here is where the staircase was that allowed you to go up into the second floor where the Opera House was. Here is a nice view of the standpipe as well, the way it looked originally. Today it has a concrete ring here because the actual tank rusted out at one point and had to be fixed. These buildings I've kind of mentioned already. This is one of the ones that burnt down in 1912, and this is another one across the street. It was a grocery store that burnt down at that same time in that terrible fire. Here is the Sunderland Grocery that I mentioned. Again, this is where they made the Bremen Banner newspaper, that he was enemies with the Bremen Inquirer. And this is the accounting house, the accounting firm today. Again, one of the oldest buildings in town that still exists. This is that same building in the 60s, 70s, after that period of renovation. It was the 1910s. It was a big period of modernization, and a lot of these buildings got their windows replaced, which they probably needed new windows by that time, obviously. But they replaced them with smaller windows and then blocks of glass brick above it. And it's a very characteristic of that 1910s period. We'll see it over and over again. But then in the 1960s, there was this major effort to renovate the buildings again with these narrow 1960s bricks on the front. And a lot of the buildings had this like weird steel, like corrugated steel siding on the front to hide the old building look. But then you can see Quinn Realtors kind of restored it more or less to its original looks. And Andersons have restored it again and again, gosh, 2 or 3 times, fairly recently, to an even more realistic old style. This is the building next to it, which is Baker Insurance. Again, one of those 3 of the oldest wood frame buildings in town. It was, at this time, in 1905, Kincaid Saloon. This is George Kincaid here. Next to him is Martin Parmenter, who had owned it previously and had a restaurant of his own in here. And these are probably just 2 random barflies that happened to be in the saloon at the time. George Kincaid, this is 1905. George Kincaid moved his saloon to the Lasser building yesterday. This was called the Lasser building. However, the building vacated by him will not be vacant long. W.F. Mott's will start a saloon there next month. I have pictures of that. That was on East Plymouth Street, and that's a building that's no longer there. It was removed in 1937. But he goes on, 6 Jag Emporiums for a town the size of Bremen is not a condition to which people point with pride. So they were very aware that they were probably doing a bit too much drinking in Bremen in general. Most of the colorful stories about things that happened in Bremen at that time were clearly driven by alcohol. And most of the work that the town marshal had to do was just, you know, wrestle guys to the ground and take them to the Huska. We had a calaboose above the Sunderland grocery store. That's where the Justice of the Peace had his office. Calaboose is like a strap iron cage, basically, you know, a prison cell of sorts. They've got one at the Napanee Heritage Center. Their calaboose is still there. It's a hoosegow. It's a strap iron cage. And in 1923-24, this saloon became a tire store, became Wiesauer Tire Store, like this. You can see this was actually a deck, and that's a door. I think we'll see another picture where we kind of see that a little more clearly. But they just turned it into a third window here. But it was a tire store for about 25 years as well. Oh, and the building next to it is the third of those oldest buildings in town, the wooden buildings. This is Guide's Cafe. It was also Marv's Cafe. It was also, when I was a kid, Maryland's Grill, and became A1 Video Store for a while, and a couple of other things, a music store, I think. Today, recently, it's been sort of a string of Mexican restaurants, and today it's La Parrilla Caliente. So it's weird to think sometimes when you go into these buildings how old they really are. You know, 150 years old, and it's the same building. And this is what they look like today, or 3 days ago when I took this picture. I'd like to say that if you want to preserve history, the first thing you have to do is capture it. So I try to take pictures around town when things change. You can see this is the result of Bremen's Main Street effort and facade program. That a lot of these people got grants from the facade program to renovate their buildings, to make them, sort of bring them back to their older looks, but in harmony with each other. 1885, again, is when the Bremen Enquirer got started, run by Brooke Baumann. It was then sold off to Cal Sininger, Charles Scott, Otto Fries, Kenny Gorell. A lot of older folks remember the Gorells owning the Enquirer, and James Crittenden later on, and of course later on it became part of the Pilot News group. These are just little tidbits to show you the kind of writing back in those days. 1887, one of the Eastern papers says that the word dude is to appear in the new edition of Webster's. Great story about that. This was teenage girls' slang for boys they thought were dodos, so they called them dodos, except, of course, being teenage girls, they had to say, he's a doo-doo, and that became sort of duty, and then they wrote it D-U-D-E, but of course people who saw it written down thought that it was dude, and that's how we got the word dude.
Dude.
So girls calling teenage boys dodos. 1888, the gum chewing brigade, he often railed against the gum chewing brigade, was out in full force Sunday evening, and things were so gummy that we actually saw several couples sticking together. 1887, the quietude of the neighborhood just across the railroad, which might properly be called Scrabble Town, we know we're on the wrong side of the railroad tracks already, was once more thrown into a state of excitement last Wednesday evening by a regular free-for-all fight composed of women and children. Stones and clubs were thrown by each party, and hard words were used. The sight was enough to make one's hair stand on end and remind him of a southern battle during war times. 1887, it was an enlightened young man of Bremen who asked the lady of his affections how she liked the look of his new style standing collar, right, the freestanding collar that stuck way up. After closely surveying him, she said, "It looks like a whitewashed fence around a lunatic asylum." It's hard to know, if you don't give names, it's hard to know how much of these were real and how much of them were kind of jokes that he got from another newspaper. They all subscribed to each other's newspapers and reprinted their stuff. In 1889, a man and a woman containing a tent, fortune wheel, and other gambling articles stopped in Bremen a short time Monday. They were en route for the big Huckleberry Marsh near Walkerton, where they intend increasing the attractions. So they noted a lot of these sorts of things. Hobos coming into town, scammers of all sorts. Lightning rods were a big scam back in those days. Gypsies and that sort of thing coming through. 1875 is, again, when the Dietrich building was built. And initially, it's this building here, this structure. And this is not Hooples, this is Hooples right next to it. This is actually an addition that was built in 1892. So it was in the style, same style as Hooples, because that was the style of the time, not this any longer. But then this became, it got renovated to harmonize with the rest of the building. This is, again, that same photo initially, but you can compare it to the 1910s photo. That is, remember when I said these fronts were replaced with glass block. This is the example of that first era of modernization. And you can see this is Hooples, and this is that addition that has had the iron front stripped off of it, and it's made to more harmonize with the rest of the building. And this is what it looks like today. Here is Hooples, same as ever. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Some parts of it are broken though. They're planning on fixing that. But this is the building, and you can see how those windows are not quite the same as these other windows, and that is why, because this was actually built quite a bit later. This, of course, is a result of the 1960s modernization, or sorry, that was 1959, technically, the modernization of this. They were very proud of themselves. The Chamber of Commerce would publish things in a newspaper, letters of commendation about people modernizing their buildings this way. The Agricultural Fair of 1889 to 1919, this was, again, a very, very big deal. They had a racetrack half-mile long, and they did harness racing. And they did picnics in the middle of it, and they had all kinds of things. This was an agricultural fair premium list. It's 120 pages long. It is crazy what you could win prizes for. It was monetary prizes for all kinds of produce and animals and stuff like that. It's just wild. This is where it was located. This is a diagram that was printed in the newspaper that I've overlaid on top of a map from Google. You can see this is Third Road. This is the missionary church here. This is Elm, which is, so Center Street comes out of town and becomes Elm Road to this day. And so this is a Piper's field. If you know the area, this is the McGowan House, and that was where the entrance was. And you see the Floral Hall, Agricultural Building, Grandstand. These are all permanent fixtures, permanent buildings. The machinery department over here, and 3 wells. And you had the half-mile track and the baseball field in the middle, and of course they parked their buggies out here and had their picnics. And then stock pens and stables is what this says over on the sides for all the animals that were going to be judged. 1892, when the standpipe was built, there is one more standpipe just like it, still in existence in Caruthersville, Missouri. It was a design by George Morgan, and 104 feet high, 68 feet of which is brick, and 38 feet is the tank. Before it was even finished, before the tank was actually put on, they had dug down below the ground level. Of course, up to this point, everybody had wells, right? Everybody had one of those pumps out in front of the house or in the back of the house. And so you only got groundwater everywhere. It was when we dug the wells for the standpipe that they went down deep enough, like 126 feet, I think, that they hit the aquifer that we use today. And that had enough power in it, the underground river is what an aquifer is. That had enough pressure in it that they could hook up the fire hoses and throw water over the buildings already, without even the additional pressure of, the whole point of having a water tower is to create water pressure for your town, right? So they had a really good source of water. 1927, the tank bottom was replaced. That's when they painted the words Bremen down the side of the tank. In 55, it was painted blue to match the new water tower, 10 times the size of it. The original was only 28,000 gallons. The new water tower in 55 was 300,000 gallons. I think we have 3 working water towers now. In 56, it was taken out of service entirely. They thought about tearing it down, but in 75, somebody who worked for the town water department, Paul Herstein, this is 1975, so we're on the verge of the bicentennial celebration. Everybody was really thinking about history and historical things, and he got it named a National Water Landmark. So the town board said, well, we can't knock it down now, that would look like idiots. So they had to renovate it, and so it's been a point of pride ever since. They painted 1776 to 1976 on the ring there, because, I don't know, for some reason, they painted everything. Paul Herstein painted the streets with no permission, just went around and painted designs for the streets. He painted he started painting the fire hydrants in Bremen. I don't know how far that spread around, but they painted over 100 fire hydrants at that time. 1893 is when Holland Radiator came in. They later called themselves American Radiator. Again, this is when Bremen became a foundry town. It immediately burnt down in 1895. So they built it again. And in 1909 is when it changed its name to American Radiator. And in 1930, when the Great Depression hit, they pulled out. They were based in Buffalo, New York, and they pulled back to Buffalo and left us without a major industry in the town. Here you see, this is north of so the town is this way, and the railroad tracks is right there. This is the railroad siding coming in right here, right? And this is the cemetery in the background at this point, right? This is the 1920s, I think. And so left us without this major industry. And the town fathers tried to get together, and Oscar Moody in particular built a brass foundry on the east side of town in what is still sometimes called the molasses plant. And but that didn't work, and it wasn't until 1939 that they managed to get together and create the gray iron foundry, which is still in operation today as BCI, Bremen Castings. 1896, it wasn't all fun and games, you know. We had train robbers sometimes. You could buy, you have to remember, in a town like this, you know, your property would be filled with trees a lot of times, so you had to cut down a lot of trees, but then you had tree stumps. You could buy dynamite at the hardware store. So as a result, people would buy dynamite at the hardware store, and then they would sneak into places that had safes and blow up the safe. That happened quite a lot, even in Bremen. And so we had quite a bit of problems with that, as well as the drunks. Sometimes they were both the same people. But in 1896, we had an actual honest-to-goodness cowboy shootout in Bremen in the form of train robbers who boarded at Garrett to the east, and they threw the Garrett station master off the train when they were going full speed at 45 miles an hour. He survived and managed to walk back to the station and send a telegram, by telegraph message to Frank Kuntz, who was the telegraph man, and his assistant. They ran off and got the night marshal. He deputized 6 men that random guys that they grabbed who were nearby, who owned shotguns and whatnot. And they were fully deputized when the train rolled in at 4:30 in the morning. And they took these guys, 5 burly bums, and had a little shootout on the train itself. And the train conductor, the engineer, helped to get these guys. So then they had to march them back to town. But halfway along, they did this little trick where they knocked off a guy's hat and then punched him in the face and then grabbed the gun. And they had a little shootout right there in the middle of the North Center Street on the way back to town. And of the 5 of them, 2 of them got away and 3 of them got recaptured. 2 of the guys who got recaptured were wounded, and none of the deputies had been shot. And so obviously those guys went to prison. I've got that, if you want to see the whole thing. That's a great question. There were various valuables and packages on the trains, right, that they could steal. But I don't know what actual cash they were after. I mean, it's 4:30 in the morning. I can't imagine there were a lot of passengers going to Chicago at that time that they could rob of their pocketbooks or whatever. So it is a little unclear of what exactly their intentions were. But there may have been, post office cash or something like that that was being transferred. 1899, the Bremen Telephone Company got started by the Kuntz brothers. Again, this is Frank Kuntz, who was the telegraph man, the night telegraph man. He and his brother, who was a pharmacist, had the Kuntz drugstore, and they were kind of characters. There's another story about how Frank Kuntz claimed to have found a gold nugget somewhere, like in Bremen, Indiana, a gold nugget. They started the telephone company in 1899 with 60 subscribers. That's what this part says here. Opened up business last Monday with 60 subscribers, and so on. And let's see, it just kind of talks about how good it is. Miss Arbella Wine is operating the new switchboard. So everybody talked to Arbella. Neither one of these is Arbella. One of them is Garnett. She was the main one later. And this actually is Ruth Kuntz, who was the daughter of Frank Kuntz. So she inherited the telephone company and the drugstore. A lot of folks remember her as running the soda fountain at the drugstore, because she, even after she sold out to Ward Summey, and he combined, there was a Fisher's drugstore and Kuntz's drugstore right next to each other. He combined those two into one drugstore, and she continued to run the soda fountain. She really enjoyed talking to the young people, and when they went off to war in World War II, a lot of them would send letters home specifically to her, and she would often get them printed in the newspaper. In 1949, it was the cutover to dialing, so we no longer had an operator for local calls. But before that, everybody had to talk to Arbella or Garnett. And that means that, for example, Dietrich Store had phone number 5 for 50 years, from 1899 to 1949. And they had these, I don't know, I still don't fully understand how the phone numbers work. To be, dial 2.5 on KL. So two long rings and one short ring. Because you had a party line, even in town in the early days, you had a party line that you shared. So you couldn't answer the phone right away. You had to wait to see how many rings it was to see if it was for you or not. So they had the switchboard in the drugstore. They moved it upstairs and then across the street to another building, which is now the Total Image building. And eventually they moved it out to the west side of town in what is today the Wagner Law Office. In 1961, it was bought out by United Utilities. It was no longer just a local telephone company. And in 2002 is when we had the area code changeover from 219 to 574, which people are still, frankly, bitter about. Early 20th century, 1900 to 1929. 1902, the tallest building was the three-story Weiss hardware store. That is no longer the case. And we'll see exactly, I think next we'll see why. In 1903, Jacob Vollmer bought a red Rambler automobile, the first person to own an automobile in Bremen. This is a red Rambler from 1903, right here. Wow. The color of fire and death is what the newspaper man reported. 1907, the new brick school was built, and that's the same time that football was ended, because in 1907, 11 college and national football players were killed playing football. And local kids got their arms broken and things like that. The big problem was, at that time it was legal, not only obviously did they have pretty primitive padding, but it was legal to have what they called the flying V. And this is where the players would like hang on to each other in a V formation. They're just physically grasping onto each other's waists in a V formation, and then they would just trample the opposition. And this was a legal thing, like, that was amazing, another touchdown. And they would kill people that way. So that was the end of football, as well as the beginning of the new school. 1907, Shadyside Park was established. That was our first park. And it was kind of in very low-lying ground, and that's when Army Ditch was built, or dug, to straighten and deepen the river to keep that area dry. 1912, Plymouth and Center Street got paved with brick, and that's also the same year that we had the worst fire in Bremen history. The paving happened, obviously, sort of piece by piece. It was just a couple of blocks at first. on Plymouth Street and a couple blocks on Center Street. And then over the years, people kept saying, like, why don't you pave ours? Why don't you pave ours? And but it was in the 1930s, I think, when the asphalt, the town actually got asphalt paving everywhere. That was 1912. 1915, we got continuous electricity that came to us from Goshen. That was the same year that Adam Kuntz got a kerosene tractor. I can't stress enough the way that farm equipment like the tractor made a huge difference in the town. You see it in the census records really clearly that prior to owning your own kerosene tractor, you could hire somebody to bring in a steam tractor to do your harvesting for you and that sort of thing. That was they talked about it being operated by 3 men and a boy and that sort of thing. That's all, only 4 people to do the whole harvesting because you didn't have to get all your neighbors. And but as soon as that happened, it turned out they realized, oh gosh, I don't need to have 10 children now. You see it in the census records where prior to the 1890s, even 1900, you saw very commonly farm families with 8, 10, 12, 14 children. And then after about 1900, 1910 or so, that dropped right off to like 3 or 4 kids. It's absolutely amazing. And it's because of the automation of the tractors. 1920, the Bremen population finally topped 2,000. Again, it's 4,700 today. It's a slow-growing town. 1923, the Union State Bank moved to their new building, which the building is now the town hall. I'll have a slide on that. 1924, the town hall / fire department / police station was built, which is now just a police station. I'll have a slide on that as well. How they thought they could get the town hall, the fire, the police station all in one building, and that's the beginning of the library and a kindergarten, all in one little building, which today barely fits all of our police department. 1925, half of the world's mint is grown in northern Indiana. It was the mint capital of the world. 1928, free in-town mail delivery begins. That's when we finally got houses, street numbers on houses, and it made a big difference. Although they didn't make a big deal about it in the newspaper, strangely enough. So here is that 3-story building, the tallest building in Bremen at the time. It was the Weiss building built in 1902. That is Sunrise Pancake House, Sunrise House of Pancakes today. And you can see what they did to it. In 1966, they took off the 3rd floor. It was probably not in great shape since it was built in 1902. It was now, 64 years old. They took off the top floor and reinforced the 2nd floor because it was bought by the Lehman Brothers to store mint oil, barrels of mint oil, which were very, very valuable. It was considered a vault because it was like $12,000 a barrel back in those days. And they also tore off the iron front and they put in the 1966 brick, which you can see here very, very clearly, this scar between the 1902 and the 1906 brick. Why they don't try to harmonize those things, I don't know. The 1960s, they like that long, thin brick for some reason. And they made this front, it was a hardware store for a long time. Today, or when they did the renovation, it became a newsstand. That's the way I remember it as a kid. That's where I bought my comic books. This is the 1907 schoolhouse. Again, there's the old schoolhouse from 1871 and then the new 1907 schoolhouse. Just a gorgeous brick schoolhouse, 1 block east of where the library is today. The library didn't exist then, but it didn't last. In 1939, they built what is today the elementary school, which became the new whole school, including the high school. And they loved it so much that they just tore this down in a few years. 1942, they tore this down. So they didn't turn it into the library. It could have been a library and kindergarten and meeting rooms and things like that. Yeah, a beautiful building that did last. Shadyside Park, 1909. You can see, if you know that park, these bumpy hills that we love for sledding. Over here was a faster hill with no bumps to it. And this was a wooden slide that was later replaced. When I was a kid, there was a metal slide there that was bumpy on one side and smooth on the other side. And it was a neat place. They also had, very shortly after this, a tennis court out to one side. Now most of that stuff is in the Sunnyside Park. Sunnyside got started much later as strictly a baseball park. And that is why we had so many, we had 17 baseball, softball, and football, and soccer fields in Bremen. It is incredible how many we need. And they keep talking about, like, I think we need another one. Do I have it here? No, I don't have it.
Time for everybody.
The weird thing about this was, this is where the waterworks was originally. And this is where the electrical substation was when they started generating their own started getting electricity from Goshen. So you don't see it here, but off to the side, there's some beautiful plantings that surround an electrical substation from the 1920s or 1910s. It was an odd thing to do. They thought it was kind of cool. And they thought light bulbs looked neat. So they just had bare light bulbs. 1910, the Dietrich Hotel was built, which was also the Bremen Bank, became Bremen State Bank. This was built by Pete Dietrich, the youngest of the Dietrich boys. And you can see there was a newsstand down here. So there was a hotel up above. The entrance to the hotel was in the middle. And the Bremen Bank was on the corner. They had done banking for a long time at the Dietrich store across Catacorner across the road. But it was done on I think it was just an informal basis. You came in and you signed a promissory note that you would repay them. So it wasn't, I don't think, really a real bank. And there's a wonderful story from a doctor in town, Doc Schlosser, Walter Schlosser, who in his memoirs says that one day his father had told him when he was 17 years old, go to John Dietrich and ask him for a loan for this much money, and take it, buy yourself a ticket, get on the train to Chicago, and buy some cattle, and then bring those cattle back home when he was 17 years old. Today, these are apartments, and the lower part is the home of the Historic Bremen History Center. It's owned by the town since the 90s. Since 1996. This is what the bank looked like at the corner back in its day, 1910. Pete Dietrich himself as one cashier, and Claude Weiss as the other cashier, and Claude Weiss embezzled some money, which is also exactly what happened to the other bank in town, Union State Bank. The cashier embezzled some money. He got away with it, he paid the money back, and he was like, no, it was just a mistake. This is that 1912 fire that I talked about. You can't see the Dunnock Brothers grocery store across the street, that burnt down. And this was the Bondurant livery stable. So there were horses, wagons, sleighs, and buggies as well in here. That were either parked here, parked here like overnight, or they were for rent. And this was the Listenberger harness shop, and it's the same building as his son's, the Listenberger millinery shop that they were built together. So this burnt down, and there was the only thing that's been built here since was a gas station for a while. But it's been otherwise more or less empty. Today there's like seating and everything. This is kind of the beginning of the Jackson Street. There's a pavilion now, parking pavilion down there. That's pretty neat, it's brand new. And other things took this place. Here is again the Anderson building, those three of the oldest buildings in town, the Anderson building. You can look at the old look of the Baker building. And this was a tailor shop when it was first built in like 1881 or so. And I'm not sure what it was in 1912 by then. I think it was a millinery shop at that point. There was a point, obviously, when you had a lot of millinery shops because women wore those great big hats with the big hat pins and everything. Unfortunately, the odd thing was that there was a guy who slept in the barn in like a little apartment, and it was his fault. It was his chimney that caught fire. But he panicked and he ran and told his boss that the thing was on fire. And then they had to call the fire department, which was across the street from the burning building. And so that delay is why all of those buildings burnt down. 1929, we got a new train depot. I don't know that this was something that the newspaper man was really hot for. We really need a new depot, but here's the old depot. It looks perfectly fine to me. But it was a big deal. We saved the beginning of Historic Bremen was 2002 when we started looking into saving the depot. And in 2008, it got moved. In 2011, it was finished and dedicated. And it is open once a month for folks who are interested in looking at the train depot. And it's restored basically to this exact look on Douglas Street on the northeast side of town. This is Union State Bank, 1923. This is the second location. The other location is now Bud's Tavern. So you can see Union State Bank here, 1923 is what it says up here. Today this is blank because this was in 1996 restored to its historical look. And this is, a lot of old folks remember this building as Welke Kipfer's, Welcome Kipfer was his name, Welke Kipfer's newsstand, and they would go there and buy their penny candy. And this was torn down, and just the first floor was kept as offices for the bank in '67, and it is still Keith Frain's office, the director of the town. His office is in here, and it's kind of a weird thing. But there were three of these buildings that looked almost identical because they were built at more or less at the same time in 1900 and 1901. This over here in the corner was called the dummy policeman. I know this picture is from 1924 because it got installed in 1924 and got knocked over and trashed in 1924. So they got rid of it. Nobody liked the dummy policeman. It was our first attempt at a traffic light. Here is what that building looked like. So in '67 is when they put this weird aggregate siding on it and the steel on the top. But this is what it looked like from the air. Just a goofy thing where it was just, surrounded that building as a fake facade. And this is again where Welke Kipfer's newsstand was. And in 1996, when they took that stuff off, this is what it looked like. They bricked over all the windows for some reason. So all that had to be torn off. All that brick had to be completely redone in order to restore it. This is what it looks like today. Or again, 3 days ago. So this is blank up here. This is 1923. So it looks a little weird. And these windows are basically fake. This is a fake door. It's just dark glass, and you can look through it, and it's just like concrete block. And then there's a middle window that's Keith Frain's office, but the other windows are fake. And then there's a real door that goes up to this, the remains of this staircase. (1924), the town hall. So this is where the fire department, police department, and the town business was, and the got an addition in the 80s. I'll pick up the pace here. The mint industry, very, very big. About 1907, Morris Brown got into growing mint. 1911, William Lehman starts growing mint, and those were the two local mint companies. Lehman became much bigger, and 1925, Indiana was growing half of the world's mint. However, by 1950, the fungus had blown in and started ruining the fields. And by 1974, that had been reduced to 25% of the world's mint. At some point, Brown merged with Liebermuth. Liebermuth still exists across the street. They bought the Lehman building, and they still deal in essential oils, including mint. 1930, the Great Depression. American Radiator pulls out. 1932, the US 6 got paved with asphalt and the coffee pot was built. 1934, Union State Bank defaults. That's when Bremen State Bank bought that building. I remember it as Bremen State Bank. Then Plymouth Street was paved with asphalt in 38. The new school was built in 39. That is today the grade school. 1940 is when we started the Bremen Firemen's Festival. 1943 is when Irma Meyer started the nursing home that became Bremen Community Hospital. So a small town had the smallest hospital in Indiana for a long, long time. And still is, I think. 1944, Woody Schramm bought Home Cash Grocery, and he started what we have today as Woody's Grocery Store. 1945, 22 area servicemen died in World War II. This is what US 6 looked like in 1932, right before it got paved. It's quite a mess. You can't have long-haul trucking on roads like that. But once it got paved, you could have long-haul truckings, and we needed things like truck stops. So this was built from a silo by Elmer Laudeman, and a lot of folks remember it. It lasted into 1978 or so. Not as a coffee pot, it was a CB radio shop before that.
Feel like they were here.
Here's that new school. A lot of folks remember the old gymnasium that had the dressing rooms under the seating that didn't move. 1939 is when Greyhound Foundry was started. Again, we were a foundry town since 1893, and now became a foundry town again, 1939. It's still a going concern as Bremen Castings. Here's what it looks like today, more or less. This is prefab housing. I want to get rid of that anyway. It became TV Time Popcorn. It was a lot of different things, but it became TV Time Popcorn. Here's the Myers Nursing Home that became the Bremen Community Hospital. And today it is the Doctors Neuropsychiatric Hospital. So it still exists, but in 2006 they built the new hospital building. Here's what it looks like from the air today. This was the old entrance to the emergency room, but it's psychiatric hospital, so it's not an emergency. It's just a patient entrance. 1962, we needed a new high school. We were chasing the baby boom, as you can imagine. 1962 was the first year that children born in 1945 turned 17, so they'd be seniors in high school that year. So they were very much chasing the baby boom. Class sizes had ballooned from 50 in 1955. This is the graduating class of 1955 was 50. And in 1965, it was 104. And it went up even further from that. That was obviously still the beginning of still part of the baby boom. 2024, there is the high school today, more or less. And you can see that the old school is here. They've added on to it a couple of times. And then this is the high school, and they've added on to it a couple of times. And then they linked them together in 1988. Here's Woody Schramm's grocery store. It was first downtown, as you see, and then moved out to where it is today. The current store was built in the parking lot of the old store. It was sort of, the old store was over here. And where I'm standing to take this picture was was a gas station that they have since purchased as part of to be part of the parking lot. But here's what it looked like sort of originally, and then added on in the 70s, and then what it looks like today. Prosperity after the war. Doc Bowen came to Bremen in 1946. The Bremen bowling lanes were opened. Kuhn's hardware store started. Dairy Queen came to Bremen in 1953. Coach Bungie started football again in 1954. And 1955, we finally built a library, a proper library of its own. And that's when Woody Schramm built his new Woody supermarket outside of the downtown area. 1958, the world's heaviest man died in Bremen. Universal Bearings was founded in 1959. But before that, actually 48, I don't have it on here, but 48, we got Bremen Bearings. That was the first bearing plant in town. 61, Bill Schlemmer opened the Teen Hop. A lot of people ask me about the Teen Hop to this day. I'm going to slide on that. The new high school opened in 62, and then Sprigament in 1963, the golf course. Same year as we got a swimming pool. Otis Bowen was born in 1918 near Rochester, served in the Army in the Pacific Theater as a doctor, and came to Bremen to take over another doctor's practice and became sort of our hometown doctor. A lot of folks still say that they're a Bowen baby because he was their mother's doctor when they were born. And but he got involved in politics in the state legislature, became the speaker, was elected to the governor twice starting in 1972, and served in Ronald Reagan's cabinet as Secretary of Health and Human Services starting in '85. My favorite story about Doc in that era was that as Secretary of Health and Human Services, he would still carry his prescription pad with him to the White House, and if somebody was sick, he would write them up a little prescription for something. Bearings. We had 3 bearings plants. Bremen Bearings in 1948, Universal in 1959, and Miller Bearings in 1971. The reason this happened because J.D. Miller had worked in another bearing plant, started his own bearing plant in Bremen. His son, Joe, Bremen Bearings was sold off to a conglomerate, and his son started another bearing plant himself. And then Universal Bearings, I think Dudley Stoller had worked for Bremen Bearings, and then he and Woody Schramm and Ivan Kelly, who ran the Kelly Buick, created Universal Bearings. So we ended up with a lot of bearings in Bremen. It's now called, let's see, Bremen Bearings and Miller Bearings were acquired by RBC, and RBC still exists with a plant in both Bremen and Plymouth. And Universal Bearing still exists. The Bremen Public Library started in 1955. On the location of the Christian Science Reading Room, it was originally called, I don't think it's really called the William E. Walter Memorial Library, but Billy Walter was the local butcher, and he was, his widow gave a lot of the money to start the library. Here's what it looked like when it first got started, the tiny little house. Here's what it looked like inside in 1985. This is the way I remember it. You can tell that because that's me right there. 1958, Robert Earl Hughes dies. When I was a kid, we would go to the school library and look up Bremen, or look up Robert Earl Hughes in the Guinness Book of World Records, because that's where it would mention that he died in Bremen, Indiana. But he had a ruptured thyroid when he was 6 years old from a whooping cough, and it made him grow to enormous size, over 1,000 pounds. And he got measles when he was at the Napanee Fair. They brought him to Bremen because Bremen still had oxygen in tanks that they could take in and out, so you didn't have oxygen just piped directly to the room. But he passed away anyway, and they buried him at his childhood home in Mount Sterling, Illinois. This is the custom casket that was made for him. He lived in a semi-trailer. Here's a couple of pictures of the teen hop that people ask me about all the time. It was interesting. It was a nonprofit, basically a nonprofit thing. It made a lot of money. They gave it away to the handicapped children, and they also helped to raise funds for the public pool, which opened in 1963. It got started because a couple of kids said, "Hey, we, as a community, we got together and built a hospital. Couldn't we get together and build a pool?" And they went around town with a petition saying, you know, would you sign our petition to start a public pool? And the JCs and other of the adults were sort of humiliated by this, and so they started their own efforts. The JCs were an amazing organization, Junior Chamber of Commerce. You aged out at 35 years old, and they didn't know how good they had it because you know, we were full, as a society, full of young men who had fought in World War II and knew how to do stuff. You know. The modern age from the 60s to today, here I'm nearing the end here. Jim Bellman founds Bellman Oil in 68. Hopcap gets started in 71. And the Wooden Peel was established, making the world's greatest pizza in 1975. We had an Oktoberfest from 77 to 91 that was very characteristic of Bremen. 1981 is when we got the Indiana State Police Post, and the Holy Walk was started that same year, 1981. 1982 is when the bypass was completed around Bremen, and the town changed quite a bit from that. 1996 is when the town hall was restored, I talked about already. The facade program started after that, and in 2020, it was a big repaving process that went right down to the old brick, got rid of the old 1915 brick, 1912 brick. And 2022, the big library renovation. It was a $3 million library renovation. Here is some stuff about Hopcap. Jim Boat started it, and they made these truck caps and that sort of thing that lasted into the 1990s, I believe. And they started Vantastic shortly after that. They were making these conversion vans. People don't remember it, but vans in the old days were basically like a plumber's vehicle. And you carried your tools and stuff around in it. And so they started putting in windows and captain seats and shag carpet, and people went nuts for it and went, "This is the greatest thing ever." And it's a great place to put that airbrush art I've always wanted. So they had these wonderful pieces of art. And the big three automakers in Detroit said, "Well, we can do that. We make those vans." And they started making minivans, and that kind of killed off the van conversion business. Wooden Peel, 1975. Old building, 1900, it was built. Before it was a pizza place, it was a Gale Lynn dress shop. And here's what it looked like in the old days. Here's what it looked like 3 days ago. Bremen Oktoberfest. It was crazy back then. It was so it started out off of the bicentennial from 1976, and people said, let's keep doing this. Let's keep having these celebrations, and let's just do it with oompa bands and stuff that are reflective of our German heritage, and bed races that are apparently also reflective of our German heritage, and cow chip tossing competitions that were apparently also very German for some reason. It kind of came back in 2016, and it's kind of a very low-key thing today. 1981, Bob Huff started the Bremen Holy Walk that is still a going operation every year. And it's out at Shoemaker Park now, but it was on the farm south of town, and then it got moved to Jim and Loretta Huff's property that was closer to town, so they could more easily ship people. But it was very, very popular. Thousands and thousands of people would attend sometimes. State Police Post in 81, 82, and the bypass around the same time. Here's a map of the bypass, still under construction here. This is a neat map because the stuff in purple is stuff that is the update from the 1954 map. So you can really see how the west side of town grew with the industrial park, and this is the Shoemaker edition and Meadowlark Lane edition down here, and that kind of thing. In recent years, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we got Southwire, Nishikawa Cooper, NISCO, Indiana Carton, John Mansville, and these other businesses come to town that make Bremen, that fill in kind of between the heavy industry of the foundry and that sort of thing, and the agricultural stuff, fill in that light industry that Bremen has needed for so long. And in 2019, we turned I was part of the operation that turned the old 1875 Lutheran church into the Bremen Community and Performing Arts Center, which is a rentable space. And in 2023, I started the Bremen Arts Workshop on the west side of town in a building that was owned by my great uncle as a Senef building products business for a long, long time. And then I mentioned the new library renovation. That's the end. The last thing I want to say again is, in order to have this kind of history, in order to preserve it, you have to capture it first. I try to go around and take pictures of things as they happen, as buildings get built, as things got torn down, and as things change. So please do that on your own. Take pictures of when things are happening, and capture those moments. Thank you very much for going.
Thank you, Derek.